Book 3, Chapter 12 of Garcia Moreno by Augustine BERTHE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. His re-election, 1874-1875. We have seen how completely the whole face of the country was changed since Garcia Moreno had resumed supreme power. But when the year 1874 drew towards its close, the great question of the new presidential election began to agitate men's minds. There was no doubt that Garcia Moreno, the idol and benefactor of the people, would obtain an immense majority of votes over any other candidate, and endless addresses, signed by thousands of electors, were issued in favour of his re-election. This exasperated the Radical Party, who, beaten in 1869, hoped to have their revenge in 1875. Not to shock the people too much, they chose for their candidate the liberal Catholic Borrero. Garcia Moreno had in vain tried to disarm this old friend by offering him office. He always refused point blank. Again, when, in 1873, the governor of Cuenca seized and exiled Borrero, Garcia Moreno reversed the sentence and brought Borrero home. But this Dictator of Ecuador, as he was called, refused all his advances. Between these two men, in fact, union was impossible. When people spoke to Garcia Moreno about the fusion of parties, he replied without hesitation: "I have always held that the struggle between good and evil was eternal. Consequently, the cause of right and religion cannot be amalgamated with that of our opponents. We will welcome all those who wish to join our ranks. We will prosecute no one except for crime. But we cannot change our convictions, which are anchored in our souls, and which nothing can shake. Give up, then, all ideas of my conversion or of fusion of parties." Borrero called him a narrow-minded bigot, but be that as it may, his liberalism, together with his enmity to Garcia Moreno, caused him to be chosen as the favoured candidate of the sects, and the new era of Guayaquil, edited by young men, moved heaven and earth in his favour. Borrero, however, felt that his chances of success were so small that he implored his friends not to risk the disgrace of a defeat. Then the refugees of Lima and other places tried to intimidate the electors by frantic articles against Garcia Moreno. One of them, Pedro Moncayo, wrote a pretended biography of the President, accusing him of every imaginable crime. Another pamphlet recommended assassination as the only way for a nation to free itself from a tyrant. The atheist, Juan Montalvo, published a pamphlet called The Perpetual Dictatorship, but which was nothing but a tissue of outrages and blasphemies against Garcia Moreno and the Church, and called forth an indignant reply from the United States Minister. "These accusations," he wrote, "make one smile with pity and contempt for their author, especially when one knows Garcia Moreno and his history. Having resided in Ecuador for many years, and being perfectly cognizant of all that has passed, I speak with a thorough knowledge of my subject, and I do not exaggerate when I say that Garcia Moreno is the most illustrious man in South America." Garcia Moreno himself received these insults with joy. God has permitted that a pamphlet should appear by Juan Montalvo against me and the Church, in which I am stigmatized as a tyrant and a thief. I have reason to know that it is the work of the Freemasons, who have already distributed 2,000 copies. But once more, I thank God that I am calumniated as a Catholic. All these manoeuvres to prevent his re-election affected him the less, as he had long wished to retire into private life. He only consented to be put in nomination if such were the absolute will of the nation, but strictly forbade his subordinates to make any efforts in favour of his candidature. On July 29, 1874, his father-in-law, Ignacio de Alcazar, wrote to reproach him for his indifferentism, adding: "If the sects triumph, religion will be persecuted and public works abandoned. Civil war will recommence, and you will be assassinated in order to get rid of you." Garcia Moreno replied: "You have forgotten that I have never intrigued to obtain the presidency, and even if I wished for it, I have no right to do anything to obtain the votes of the electors. If, by the will of God, the people give me their suffrages, I will accept the presidency, because in that case I could not refuse, without being wanting in my duty to the nation." Again, on the 12th of September, Ignacio returned to the charge, complaining of his inactivity when his enemies were moving heaven and earth against him. "I do not understand," answered Garcia Moreno, "what you want my ministers to do. As private persons they are free to vote as they like, but as public functionaries I exact that they shall not take part in any propaganda in my favour." These letters to a relation whom he so tenderly loved proved that Garcia Moreno submitted to his re-election, but did not wish for it. The people, however, did not take that view, and determined to re-elect him at whatever cost, so that finally Borrero withdrew his candidature, but after a furious diatribe against Garcia Moreno in the New Era, declaring that the article in the Constitution which authorized his re-election was simply an invention of his own to ensure his perpetual presidency. But the editors had reckoned too far on Garcia Moreno's patience. He summoned Morán and Valverde before the court at Guayaquil for their seditious articles, and when the judge acquitted them from fear of the revolutionists, Garcia Moreno appealed to the Tribunal of Quito. Letters from Cuenca at the same time warned him that a revolution was about to break out in Guayaquil under the leadership of a certain Colonel Polanco, an officer of artillery. The government accordingly degraded Polanco, and when the Quito tribunal, with the cowardice of their Guayaquil brethren, refused to give judgment in the matter of the newspaper articles, Garcia Moreno took the matter in his own hands. Having shown his council the fresh dangers with which the country was threatened, he placed the provinces of Guayaquil and Cuenca in a state of siege, and having summoned before him Morán and Valverde, ordered them to disavow publicly their infamous articles. On their refusal, he exiled them to Peru, while Dr. Arizaga, the alter ego of Borrero, was imprisoned in Quito. These affairs took place in the beginning of January 1875. 50 days of the state of siege sufficed to put down the radical insurrection. Powerless to demolish the tyrant, as the followers of Borrero called Garcia Moreno, they retired from the fight, leaving the vile slaves to reinstate Garcia Moreno once more in the President's chair. The election took place in May with the most perfect quiet. Without promises or menaces or any excitement, 23,000 electors spontaneously and joyfully gave their votes for the man whom they justly called the saviour of their country. The Radicals, finding all their efforts fruitless to weaken his popularity, then made up their minds to resort to extreme measures, and secretly prepared their daggers and revolvers. End of Part 3, Chapter 12. Part 3, Chapter 13 of Garcia Moreno by Augustine BERTHE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. The Assassination. It is impossible in these days to ignore the existence of a secret society called Freemasonry, of which the secret consists in uniting itself with the devil to destroy the reign of God upon the earth. For a long time they dissimulated their infamous designs under the specious guise of philanthropy, but now they work openly. "Écrasez l'infâme," they cried with Voltaire, which in plain English means, "Destroy Jesus Christ." "Clericalism is the great enemy," exclaimed the other day one of their heads, but when he used the word clericalism, he meant Christianity. The whole of the horrible ritual of the sects may be summed up in the words of Proudhon, one of their leaders. "Listen to my words. The first duty of every intelligent man is to drive the idea of God from his mind and conscience. Lying spirit, imbecile God, thy reign is at an end. Seek for other victims among the beasts. Thou art dethroned and broken in pieces. Come, Satan, come, though calumniated by priests and kings, let me embrace thee and hug thee to my breast. Thou knowest me for a long while, and I know thee. God is hypocrisy and lies. God is tyranny and misery. God is the real spirit of evil. Thou alone, O Satan, canst ennoble work and place the seal on virtue." All Freemasons do not use as strong language as Proudhon, but all have in their hearts the same hatred of good and the same love of evil. Leo XIII exclaims in one of his encyclicals, "They do not attempt to hide it any longer. They are audacious enough to lift their arm against God and openly plot to deprive the world of all faith in Jesus Christ and His benefits." We can easily understand, therefore, what was their rage against Garcia Moreno, who had exposed and defeated their schemes throughout Ecuador. All the Freemason newspapers throughout the world, in Europe as in America, held him up to public execration, and finally he was solemnly condemned to death by the Great Council of the Order. The plots for his assassination became so notorious that many people implored him to take extra precautions and not to expose so precious a life needlessly. But he would not listen. In answer to a religious who wrote to him on the subject, he wrote, "I am very grateful for your charitable advice, though it tells me nothing new. I know very well that certain men wish for my death, but these wishes only injure those who form them. Tell the person who gave you the warning that I fear God, but God alone. I forgive my enemies with all my heart. I would do good to them if I knew who they were, and if they gave me the opportunity." To Don Ignacio and other devoted friends he made similar answers. To the editor of the National, who had denounced these Cains, comparing Garcia Moreno to Abel, and adding, Abel forgave his brother, but his blood did not the less cry out to heaven for vengeance. Strike then, O Cains, but know that God will avenge his own." Garcia Moreno wrote, saying, "This is not the language a government should hold which is striving to do what is right without fear of the consequences. If these men desire to kill me, let them come. They will not slaughter us as timid sheep. God will be our buckler against the enemy. If I fall, nothing can be more desirable or glorious for a Catholic, for the recompense is an eternal one." The inhabitants of Quito, however, watched with increasing anxiety nightly meetings in the house of the Peruvian minister of men who were well-known enemies of the President. There was Polanco, a man of good family, who had intended to become a monk, but had given up all religious practices and now vowed eternal hatred to Garcia Moreno. Then Moncayo, who had passed some years in a religious community, and to whom, when he came out, the President had refused office. Campuzano, an old conspirator. Andrade, the son of a peasant of Ibarra. Cornejo, a young man of respectable family, formerly devoted to Garcia Moreno, but now perverted by the sects. Lastly, a Granader named Rayo, who had held an important post from which he had been dismissed by the President for malpractices, and now had turned saddler to gain his livelihood, but who had vowed eternal vengeance against the man who had detected and punished him. Another man, named Cortes, arrived at Quito under suspicious circumstances, and spent his time at the Peruvian embassy, and declaiming against despots and singing hymns of liberty. He pushed his insolence so far that Garcia Moreno ordered him to leave the territory of the Republic. But the conspirators continued their secret correspondence with their accomplices at Lima, and that in the most audacious manner. The aide-de-camp of Garcia Moreno found one day certain letters on his desk, waiting for the government stamp. Suspecting their nature, Garcia Moreno opened them and found they were for Urbina, from the revolutionists of Quito. Monsignor Ventinelli, in the same way, being at Guayaquil in the month of July, 1875, on his way to embark for Europe, opened a packet of letters addressed to him from Lima, and found they were intended for Polanco, to whom he unsuspectingly forwarded them through a Jesuit father. They contained the last instructions of the lodges. No one could disguise the imminence of the danger, and the prelate, who was devoted to Garcia Moreno, said to him, "It is a matter of public notoriety that the sects have publicly condemned you, and that their assassins are sharpening their poignards. For the love of God, take some precautions." "And what precautions do you suggest?" replied the President. "Never to go out without an escort? And who will defend me against the escort, if they, too, should be corrupted? I would rather place my trust in God." And he added the words of the psalmist: "Nisi Dominus custodiet civitatem, frustra vigilat qui custodit eum." It was under these sad circumstances that he wrote his last letter to the Sovereign Pontiff, which breathes throughout the piety of a saint and the courage of a martyr. "I implore your benediction, most Holy Father, having, without any merit on my part, been again elected President of this Catholic Republic. The new presidential era only begins on the 30th of August, when I shall have to take the oath to the Constitution, and when it will be my duty to give official notice of it to your Holiness. But I wish to let you know it today, so as to obtain from Heaven the light and strength which I need now more than at any other time, to remain the devoted son of our Holy Redeemer and the loyal and obedient servant of His Vicar. Today, when all Masonic lodges, excited by those in Germany and Belgium, utter against me the vilest and most horrible calumnies, and are moving heaven and earth to find means to assassinate me, I need more than ever the divine protection, so as to live and die for the defense of our holy religion and of this great Republic, which God has called upon me to govern. What greater happiness can be awarded to me, most Holy Father, than to see myself detested and calumniated for the love of our divine Redeemer? But what still greater happiness would it be if your benediction could obtain from Heaven the grace to shed my blood for Him who, being God, has deigned to shed every drop of His at the pillar and upon the cross." He then asked two favours of the Pope: one, some nuns for the leper hospital; the other, the relics of St. Peter Claver, abandoned at Carthagena. "Your Holiness," he continued, "has beatified this apostle of Catholic charity, and cannot wish his precious remains to lie in a place where they are neither appreciated nor venerated. Our poor Ecuador neither seeks for nor desires other protection than that of God, and will be too happy to have, then, another advocate in heaven." Full of these holy thoughts, Garcia Moreno set himself quietly to work to prepare his message for the coming Congress, which was to open on the 10th of August. On the feast of St. Anne, 26th July, who was the patroness of his wife, Among the many letters of congratulation which she received was one warning her to watch with still greater vigilance over her husband's life, as his assassins were determined before long to carry out their threats. On this occasion his friends again renewed their entreaties for him to take measures lest he should fall into their hands. He only replied joyously, "Well, what does a traveller wish but to arrive at the end of his journey, or a sailor but to see the shores of his own country after a bad and dangerous voyage? I cannot consent to have a guard. My fate is in the hands of God, who will take me out of this world when and how it may please Him." On the 2nd of August a religious wrote to him from Latacunga that the conspiracy would break out in a few days, and that a man named Rayo was amongst them. "Rayo!" exclaimed Garcia Moreno, "it must be an infamous calumny. I saw him in Holy Communion only a few days ago. A Christian cannot be an assassin." In fact, this man had so dissembled his villainy that the President mistrusted him so little that, wishing to take a ride with his boy on the 10th of August, he had ordered a new saddle for the little Gabriel from this very Rayo. On the 4th of August he wrote a last letter to his friend Juan Aguirre, who, ever since his college days, had been his intimate friend. A few months before, on the eve of starting for Europe, Juan had come to wish him good-bye. After a long and intimate talk, Garcia Moreno accompanied his friend to the door, and embracing him warmly, exclaimed, "I feel we shall never see each other again. It is our last good-bye." Then turning aside not to show the tears which rushed into his eyes, he repeated, "Adieu, we shall never meet again on earth." On the 4th of August he reminded his friend of this presentiment, and added, "I am about to be assassinated, but I am happy to die for my faith. We shall meet one another in heaven." On the 5th of August, wishing to finish his message to Congress, he told his aide-de-camp not to admit anyone. Towards evening a priest arrived and implored to see the President. The officer refused, but the priest insisted, saying that the communication he had to make could not be put off till the next day. Being admitted, he said, "You have been warned that your death was decreed by the Freemasons, but you have not been told when. I have just heard that the assassins are going to try and carry out their plot at once, perhaps tomorrow. For God's sake, take your measures accordingly." "I have already received similar warnings," replied Garcia Moreno calmly. "And after having calmly reflected, I have come to the conclusion that the only measure I can take is to prepare myself to appear before God." And he then went on with his work as if a message of no importance had been given to him. It was remarked, nevertheless, that he passed the greater part of the night in prayer. The next day was the 6th of August, the feast of the Transfiguration. At 6 o'clock in the morning he went as usual to the Dominican church to hear Mass. It was the first Friday of the month, the day specially dedicated to the Sacred Heart. With many others of the faithful, the President drew near to the altar and received the God of the Eucharist as the Viaticum for his last journey, for after having received so many warnings, he could not doubt that he was in danger of death. He prolonged his thanksgiving and prayer till 8 o'clock. The conspirators had been watching him all the morning and were stationed in the square opposite the church in little groups, where they remained during Mass. They meant to attack him on coming out of church, but were deterred by the number of people who came out at the same time. He therefore came back safely to his own house, spent some time with his wife and son, and then went to his own room to give the last touches to his message, which he was to communicate that day to his ministers. Towards 1 o'clock, with his manuscript in his hand, he went with his aide-de-camp towards the palace, stopping on his way at a relation of his wife's, whose house was on the Plaza Major. As the heat was extreme, he took some cooling drink, which put him in a perspiration, and obliged him to button up his coat on going out. An insignificant act, which nevertheless had fatal consequences. At this moment the conspirators were in a cafe in the square watching the movements of their victim. As soon as they perceived him, they went out, one by one, and hid behind the columns of the peristyle, each in the place assigned to him by Polanco, who himself went to the other side of the square to watch the event. The President, before going to the palace, wished to adore the Blessed Sacrament, which that day was exposed in the cathedral. [Footnote: The cathedral and the palace or government house form one of the angles of the Plaza Major. For a long time he remained kneeling on the floor of the church, absorbed in recollection and prayer. As, at the approach of night, created objects disappear, and nature seems to repose in a solemn calm, God, at the supreme moment, dispelled all earthly thoughts from the soul of His servant and drew him nearer to Himself in the repose of a celestial union. One of the assassins, Rayo, impatient of a delay which might prove fatal to their plans, sent a messenger to the President to say that he was wanted for some pressing business. Garcia Moreno rose at once, left the cathedral, and had already made 3 or 4 steps towards the door of the palace, when Rayo, drawing a huge cutlass, called in the country a machete, from under his cloak, inflicted a terrible wound on his shoulder. "Vile assassin!" cried the President, trying in vain to seize his revolver in his buttoned-up coat, while Rayo inflicted a fresh wound on his head, and the other conspirators fired at him with their revolvers. At that moment a young man sprang upon Rayo and tried to disarm him, but was wounded himself, and had to let go his hold. Pierced with balls, and with his head bleeding, the heroic victim still tried to defend himself and disengage his revolver, when Rayo, with a double blow of his cutlass, severed his left arm and cut off his right hand. A second discharge threw the martyr to the bottom of the steps, where, stretched on the ground and covered with blood, he remained motionless when the ferocious Rayo again assaulted him, crying out, "Die, destroyer of liberty!" "Dios no muere," murmured for the last time the Christian hero. All this was the work of a moment. The noise of the firing drew everyone to the windows, while a panic filled every heart. The public functionaries barricaded the palace, thinking that they were all about to be murdered. The aide-de-camp had rushed off to the barracks for help, while Polanco, Cornejo, and Andrade took to flight, crying, "The tyrant is dead!" Women flew to help the President from their shops under the arcade, rending the air with their cries. In a few minutes the square was filled with people, the soldiers in vain seeking for the assassins, the priest of the cathedral hurrying to give the last consolation of religion to the murdered man, if he were still breathing. He could not answer them or move, but his eyes showed that he was not unconscious. He was carried into the cathedral and laid at the feet of Our Lady of 7 Dolours. A surgeon tried to stop his gaping wounds, but it was useless. His livid and discoloured lips showed that he was on the point of expiring. A priest asked him to forgive his murderers. His dying look answered that he had done so. The pardon of God descended upon him with the absolution. Extreme unction was administered to him in the midst of the sobs and tears of all the assistants, and a quarter of an hour later he expired. During this quarter of an hour of agony another scene took place in the square. A ball intended for the President struck Rayo in the leg, so that he could not escape with arrest. Thinking to provoke a radical demonstration, he brandished his weapon in the air, glorying in having immolated the tyrant. One of the soldiers, furious at the death of his beloved general, pointed his gun at him. "You have no right to kill me," screamed Rayo. "And you, what right had you to assassinate my master?" replied the soldier, and shot him dead on the spot. His body, seized by the furious people, was dragged with every indignity, by a cord round his neck, through the streets of the city, and finally thrown into a public cesspool, only to be buried afterwards in a spot reserved for parricides and excommunicated persons. Large cheques on the Bank of Peru, found in the pockets of the assassin, prove that the Venerable Order of Freemasons, like the Great Council of the Jews, does not spare its gold to the Judas it employs. In the evening of that fateful day, the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Guerrero, made an official report on the body of the President. The martyr had received 5 or 6 bullets and 14 blows of the terrible cutlass, one of which had pierced his brain. He had, in fact, 7 or 8 mortal wounds. On the breast of the President was a relic of the True Cross, the scapular of the Passion and that of the Sacred Heart. Round his neck they found his rosary, to which a medal was attached, representing on one side Pope Pius IX and on the other the Vatican Council. The effigy of Pius IX was stained with his blood, as if to prove by this touching symbolism that the love of the Church and its head had caused the death of the glorious martyr. An agenda of his daily notes was also found upon him. On the last page he had, on that very day, written in pencil these few words, which are worthy of a saint: "My Saviour, Jesus Christ, give me greater love for Thee and profound humility, and teach me what I should do this day for Thy greater glory and service." If we ask ourselves why God permitted that the blood of one whom He had created expressly, as it seemed, for the regeneration of His country and the triumph of the Church, should be shed by vile criminals, we can only answer that it pleases God to glorify in a special manner those who have the most bravely confessed His truth. The supreme glory is to seal with one's blood the truth one has defended by word and deed. God gave this glory to His Son, to the martyrs of the Church throughout all ages, and to Garcia Moreno. But did the people, so devoted to him, deserve this chastisement? No, but let them take courage. As the blood of the martyr was the seed of the Church, so the blood of Garcia Moreno will produce, not only in Ecuador, but in other nations, true champions of the people and of the Church of God. A man dies, but God does not. Dios no muere. End of Book 3, Chapter 13. Part 3, Chapter 14 of Garcia Moreno by Augustine BERTHE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. The Mourning, 1875. No sooner had the death of Garcia Moreno become known than the whole town went into mourning. The streets were hung with black, the bells tolled from all the churches, the cannon sounded hour by hour, and the grief of the people was so universal that one might have imagined that each family had lost its dearest member. Instead of breaking out in a revolution, as the radicals hoped, the whole capital was filled with sorrow and consternation. The official journals justly interpreted the public feeling when they wrote, "Under the weight of this terrible and unexpected sorrow, all life seems to have stopped short. Men's lips are dumb and their hearts fail them. By destroying our chief, a band of villains flattered themselves that they would at the same time annihilate our religion and our country. But the spirit of Garcia Moreno abides with us, and the martyr in heaven will plead for his sorrowing people." In fact, there was not a semblance of disorder. The assassins fled in different directions, not to be themselves torn to pieces by public vengeance. The Vice President, Don Xavier Leon, was declared the head of the executive, and placed the Republic in a state of siege. By a circular addressed to the governors of the provinces, he ordered them to use every means to track the murderers. Appealing to the army, he said, "Officers and soldiers, men whose hands are still red with the blood of your beloved General-in-Chief, may strive to enlist you under another banner than that of religion and your country. But you will not forget his teaching, you will be faithful to his laws. Brave soldiers, turn your eyes towards heaven, see on the head of him for whom you are weeping the glorious crown of a martyr, and swear to defend the institutions for which he gave his life." From Cuenca, Guayaquil, and all the other provinces came protestations of devotion to the country and of the deepest sorrow, while the whole diplomatic corps associated itself with the grief of the nation. The 9th of August was the day fixed for the public funeral in the Metropolitan Church. On the catafalque were engraved these words as a summary of his life: "To the regenerator of his country and the invincible defender of the Catholic faith." During the 3 days which elapsed between his death and the funeral, the body was exposed, seated in an armchair, dressed in his presidential uniform, and surrounded by his guards. One would have thought he was only asleep. His assassins had hacked his body to pieces, but respected his face, of which the manly and expressive features remained intact. During 3 days, the sobbing people crowded without intermission round the bier, not only from Quito, but from all the neighbourhood. An interminable procession of men, women, and children went to pray by the body, and left it, crying bitterly and exclaiming, "We have lost our father, he has shed his blood for us." On the day of the funeral, a magnificent catafalque was erected in the cathedral, on which lay the body of the President in his general's uniform, the head still uncovered. Then came the Archbishop and his clergy, the members of the government, and all the civil and military authorities. Only the President's chair of state remained vacant, and at the sight of that the people burst out in tears and groans. The emotion was redoubled when Don Vincent Cuestra, *, Dean of the Cathedral of Riobamba and Senator, applied the words of Holy Writ to this new Judas Maccabeus. The people of Israel bewailed him with great lamentations, and said, "How is the mighty man fallen that saved the people of Israel?" 1 Maccabees 9:20-21. After dwelling on the terrible event, he exclaimed, "O God of nations, how is it thou hast permitted the sentinel of thy house, this defender of thy church, the glory and pride of his people, thus to fall by the hands of the impious, bathed in his own blood? O my God, prostrate before thine infinite majesty, we can but adore thine inscrutable designs. Thou hast given him to us, and thou hast taken him away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. We will strive to drive from our hearts all feelings of vengeance, and will not even ask his assassins, 'Cains, what have you done with the blood of this just man?'" Sobs stifled the voice of the orator as he described not only his public acts, but his personal and private virtues, his faith, piety, charity, and zeal, and his late noble protest against the invasion of the Pontifical States, which had attracted the attention of the whole world to their nation, and added: "The soldier of God has died as a martyr to his zeal and his faith." Then apostrophizing the body, he exclaimed: "Garcia Moreno, your eyes do not see our tears, your ears cannot hear the lamentations of your people. Your noble heart no longer beats in your breast, but your soul understands us. Ah, from that happy region to which your heroic virtue has brought you, look down in pity on your children. Do not abandon your country to anarchy and ruin. Ask of God to raise up a man worthy to succeed you, one who will carry on your great work, and will know how to say with you, adveniat regnum tuum." Towards the end of the ceremony, the rumour spread among the people that an attempt had been made to murder little Gabriel, the late President's son, and that some men had disinterred Rayo to place him in consecrated ground. The body of Garcia Moreno was, in consequence, secretly and provisionally placed in an unknown grave, so as to save it from the risk of sacrilegious profanation. These infamies so exasperated the people that they were determined to make an end of the assassins. Polanco and Campuzano were already in prison. The former hoped that a radical pronunciamiento would follow on the President's assassination, but on seeing the indignation of the people and the fury of the soldiers, he ran to take refuge in a shop, and afterwards tried to escape to a safer retreat. But the soldiers followed and seized him. Young Cornejo had hid himself in a hut on the mountains, and sent a servant to get his things, but this man found the house deserted. Cornejo's parents, inconsolable at the crime of their son, had disappeared, so that all he could do was to go with a light and try and collect some of the clothes of the fugitive. One of the neighbours watched and followed him. The servant was arrested and condemned to be instantly shot, unless he would reveal Cornejo's hiding place. Cornejo, hearing through an Indian of the approach of the troops, escaped to the woods. The soldiers surrounded them, but finding that he could not be dislodged from the thickets, the exasperated peasants set fire to the forest. Seeing the flames coming near him, Cornejo got into the hollow of a tree and had nearly baffled pursuit when he lifted up his head to get some air, was seen by a soldier, and nearly torn to pieces by the people. Tried by a council of war, Cornejo made a complete confession, which proved that Polanco had been the soul of the whole tragedy. Condemned to death, he expressed true contrition and wrote a letter to his mother, saying: "I am glad to die to expiate my crime, and to have had the happiness before my death of being reconciled to God. If I had escaped, I should have been lost for ever." Just before, Campuzano had paid his debt to justice. After his condemnation he was offered life if he would reveal the names of his accomplices. "It is useless," exclaimed the poor wretch. "My companions would never forgive me. I had rather be shot than stabbed." Polanco, strangely enough, was only condemned to 10 years' imprisonment. But God was less patient than the court. He escaped 2 years later during a revolution, and pouring out blasphemies against the Sacred Heart, told the soldier to fire on the banner, when a ball hit him dead on the spot. Andrade and Moncayo managed to gain the frontier and remained in exile till the temporary triumph of Vintimilla in 1877. But although, to the great scandal of the people, the Radical government allowed them to return, they were obliged to fly from the menaces and contempt of their countrymen, who would have nothing to say to Garcia Moreno's murderers. A few days after the funeral, the Chambers met. Vice President Leon informed the senators and deputies of the measures taken to preserve public order, and added: "It is at the election of a new President that men of honour must meet. We will leave revolt and assassination to others. As for me, I only wish to return into private life. I should prefer exile to supreme power, when I see what has been the reward given to the most noble and generous of men. As the Minister, the friend and companion of the late President, I have now but one wish, and that is, to weep, in the midst of my family, for the purest, best, and most virtuous man I have ever known." The Minister of the Interior then presented to Congress the message which Garcia Moreno had in his hand at the moment of his assassination. It is impossible to express the emotion caused in the House by the sight of this MS, all stained with his blood, in which the father of his people had expressed his supreme wishes, and the reading of which was listened to in a kind of religious silence. "A few years ago," wrote Garcia Moreno, "Ecuador repeated sadly the complaint of Bolivar when he addressed his last message to the Congress of 1830. I blush to own it. We have conquered our independence, it is true, but at the cost of every other good. Since the time that, placing all our hope in God, we have left the current of impiety and apostasy which seems to carry away the world in these days of blindness, and that we have reorganized ourselves, in 1869, as a really Catholic country, all has gone on improving from day to day for the welfare and prosperity of our beloved country." Then he gave a summary of all that had been done in the different branches of the administration, and wound up with the touching words: "In a few days the mandate confided in me in 1869 will have expired. The Republic has enjoyed 6 years of peace, and during that time has marched on steadily in the path of progress under the visible protection of Divine Providence. The results obtained would have been greater if I had possessed all the qualities required for good government, or if, to do good, it were enough ardently to desire it. If I have committed faults, I ask your pardon for them 1,000 times, and beg my countrymen to believe that my will has never ceased to try and follow out what seemed to me best for the nation. If, on the contrary, you think I have succeeded in anything, attribute the merit first to God and to the Immaculate Dispenser of the treasures of His mercy, and next to yourselves, to the people, to the army, and to all those who in the different branches of the government have helped me with so much intelligence and fidelity to carry out my difficult duties. The Congress was worthy of such a message. It answered by a manifesto in honour of Garcia the Great, great not only in the eyes of the people of Ecuador, but of America and of the whole world, and determined to perpetuate his memory by raising a monument to commemorate the benefits he had conferred on his country. In the session of the 16th of September, they issued a decree in which, after enumerating the many great works he had successfully undertaken and carried out, in the religious, moral, material, and intellectual order, it adds: "Ecuador, by the mouth of its representatives, accords to the memory of the most excellent Don Gabriel Garcia Moreno the homage of her eternal gratitude, and to glorify him according to his deserts, discerns to him the name of the regenerator of his country and the martyr of Catholic civilization. To preserve his mortal remains, a mausoleum shall be raised worthy of this great and noble man, on a site chosen by the Executive. To recommend his glorious name to the esteem and respect of posterity, a marble statue shall be raised in his honour, which shall bear on its pedestal the following inscription: To Garcia Moreno, the most noble of the sons of Ecuador, dying for religion and his country, a grateful Republic." In the halls of the Municipal Council and other official assemblies, the bust of Garcia Moreno shall be also placed with the inscription: To the regenerator of his country, to the martyr of Catholic civilization. The great national road and the railroad, which were the principal material works of the late President, shall both bear the name of Garcia Moreno. We must go far back in history before we shall find a man grand enough to deserve such praises, or a man just enough to award them. But all nations combine to do him honour, not only in New Granada and Chile, but in Buenos Aires, Lima, and in North America. The most eloquent panegyrics of the hero and martyr appeared in every paper. The Confraternity of St. Michael at New York decreed that on the 6th of August a solemn Mass should be offered up yearly, on this glorious anniversary, at which all the members of the Confraternity should assist, with the intention of asking God, through the intercession of this great Christian martyr, that his heroism should fill the hearts of all Catholics from one end of America to the other. In Europe, the sensation caused by his death was almost as great. The papers in Spain, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, and England vied with one another in describing the episodes of his glorious life and still more heroic death. In Paris, at St. Sulpice, solemn obsequies were celebrated in his honour, while at Notre Dame an eloquent sermon preached by a well-known Jesuit orator asked his hearers to recognize in Garcia Moreno the just man of our century. Louis Violat, in the Universe of September 27, 1875, read a magnificent leader in his honour. And above all, Pius IX publicly honoured this son, who was indeed and in truth so worthy of him. In an address to the pilgrims of Laval on the 20th of September, after speaking of the iniquities committed by the sects, not only in Europe but in America, that great pontiff continued with tears in his voice: "In the midst of all this, the Republic of Ecuador was miraculously distinguished by the spirit of justice and the unshakable faith of its President, who showed himself ever the submissive son of the Church, full of devotion for the Holy See, and of zeal to maintain religion and piety throughout his nation. And now the impious, in their blind fury, look as an insult upon their pretended modern civilization, upon the existence of a government, which, while consecrating itself to the material well-being of the people, strives at the same time to assure its moral and spiritual progress. Then, in the councils of darkness organized by the sects, these villains decree the murder of the illustrious President. He fell under the steel of an assassin, as a victim to his faith and Christian charity. Pius IX also, the death of Garcia Moreno is the death of a martyr." The Pope did not limit himself to words. A few days later he had a magnificent funeral service celebrated for the soul of Garcia Moreno, as pontiffs do when God has taken away one of the most eminent children of the Church, and when certain Italian Catholics determined to erect a statue in his honour, Pius IX largely contributed to it and placed it in the American College. On the four sides of this monument is the following inscription: Religionis integrimus custos, auctor studorium optimorum, obsequentissimus in Christi sedem, justitiae cultor scelerum vindix. The marble likewise tells the story of his martyrdom and the profound mourning of the Catholic world. Gabriel Garcia Moreno, sumus republicae quitensis, in America praeses impia manu per proditionem interemptus nonis aug. AD 1875, cujus virtutum et gloriose mortis casum admiratione et laudibus diri casus et Josiatem boni omnes prosecuti sunt Pius IX. Max pecuniat sua et plurim collationi et Gregory de Ecclesia et Republica merito. Pius IX. And Garcia Moreno, both crusaders against the Revolution, one martyred by it, the other imprisoned, the prisoner praising the martyr before the world and God, who never dies, crowning both. This is indeed a glorious remembrance on which to dwell. End of Part 3, Chapter 14. Epilogue, Chapter 1 of Garcia Moreno by Augustine BERTHE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Ecuador after Garcia Moreno. Our readers will probably ask themselves with some anxiety what became of the Christian Republic after the crime of the 6th of August. Did the Revolution succeed in its odious and bloody reaction, or were the people faithful to their great and heroic chief? A glance at the history of the Republic during the last 10 or 12 years will show the political wisdom and foresight, as well as the posthumous influence of the martyred hero. The President Borrero, 1875-1876. The day after the assassination, the Vice President Leon consented to remain in power until the election of a fresh president. Ecuador, in consequence, remained calm and quiet for 3 months, but then came the fresh elections, and the liberal Borrero was chosen, whose first act was to inveigh against the Constitution which he had sworn to defend. The Radicals, enchanted at his proposed reforms, began to agitate the whole country in his favour. An old officer unveiled the plot of the revolutionists who wished to substitute Pedro Carbo for Borrero and bring back Urbina as General-in-Chief of the army. "I pity Borrero," exclaimed the veteran. "If he yields to the Radical cry, he will lose himself and the country with him. His only chance is to adopt the motto of Garcia Moreno, liberty for all and for everything except for evil and wrongdoers." Borrero tried to temporize between the two parties, but allowed the most shameful abuse of religion in the papers, and dismissed such of the ministers as were unfavourable to his new plans of reform. To his great disgust, however, the people remained faithful to their late chief, and on the anniversary of his death, in 1876, made a magnificent demonstration in his honour. The whole city went into mourning, while at his solemn obsequies in the cathedral everyone attended save Borrero himself and a few of his officials. Don Miguel Garces pronounced the funeral oration, in which he declared that, if Constantine were considered great for having given peace to the Church, Theodosius for having protected it, and Charlemagne for having saved it from the barbarians, Garcia Moreno, with still more faith, zeal, and energy, had made himself the champion of the holiest of causes, and that to eclipse all other heroes he had only needed a wider field for his great genius. But Borrero continued blind to the political wisdom of his predecessor. To try their strength, the Radicals organized a revolution in Guayaquil, which was easily put down, but the leaders of which were pardoned by Borrero. To find a more effective tool, they then pitched upon Vintimilla, a man without faith or principle, ignorant, stupid, a drunkard, and a gambler, whom they insisted on having as commandant of the troops at Guayaquil. Even Borrero was startled at this demand, but too weak to resist, he gave him the appointment. Vintimilla began by dismissing all the good and faithful officers to replace them with his accomplices. Borrero, warned of his treason, wrote to expostulate. Vintimilla replied that if he had changed his subordinates, it was only because he suspected their loyalty, they having served the tyrant, Garcia Moreno, for 15 years. that if the President disapproved of this act of prudence, he, Vintimilla, could only resign, as a soldier, like a woman, has only his honour, which if doubted, is lost for ever. Borrero was foolish enough to believe in him. Vintimilla next asked for some troops to be sent to him from Quito, pretending to fear an insurrection on the approaching feast of the Independence. In spite of the entreaties of his friends, Borrero fell into the trap and sent him the men and arms required. All means of defence being thus taken away from the capital, Vintimilla threw aside the mask. On the 8th of September the Radicals issued a proclamation declaring that Borrero was a traitor to all liberal principles, and by his absurd policy was perpetuating institutions incompatible with a democratic government, so that they refused any longer to obey him, and proclaimed the great citizen Ignacio Vintimilla President of the Republic. Borrero was thunderstruck at this treachery, and instantly made an appeal to arms. The Conservatives joined him to repress the revolt, but unhappily Borrero always mistrusted them and refused to employ the only capable generals. The troops remained inactive at Guaranda for a month, during which time Vintimilla's preparations were completed, and he marched down Guaranda at the head of an army, while Urbina attacked Riobamba with a smaller corps. General Sanz, having only a small force at Guaranda, went to meet Urbina, who defeated him in the Battle of Gote, while Vintimilla, having passed through the feeble troops at Guaranda, arrived in triumph at Quito. The country fell altogether into the hands of the Red Republicans. Borrero was thrown into prison, where he lingered for 2 months, and was finally exiled to Lima, and thus the great work of Garcia Moreno was threatened with entire destruction. End of Epilogue, Chapter 1. Epilogue, Chapter 2 of Garcia Moreno by Augustine BERTHE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. The Dictator Vintimilla, 1877 to 1883. Under the specious name of regeneration, Vintimilla brought to his country ruin and death. A decree of February 1, 1877, on the secularization of education inaugurated the era of persecution. The bishops and clergy protested. They were threatened with exile. Then the Archbishop of Quito, Monsignor Chica, declared that he would oppose with all his strength the propagation of error in his diocese. A fortnight later, this holy and venerable prelate was poisoned on Good Friday, strychnine having been put into the wine used for the Holy Sacrifice. Then the government ordered a funeral service to be celebrated in memory of the soldiers who had fallen in the revolt of Vintimilla, victims of their devotion to liberty and their hatred of tyrants. Needless to say that the bishops refused to allow their ministry to be thus profaned. Vintimilla vowed to be revenged, and chose for his next victim Dr. Ansenio Andrade, Victor Capitular of Quito. A body of young men without arms had striven to resist the tyrant and been defeated. Vintimilla ordered the church bells to be rung to celebrate the victory. Andrade refused. Vintimilla inflicted a fine on all the clergy of the capital. Andrade forbade them to pay it, and then feeling sure of arrest, left in the hands of the chapter a decree of interdict on all the churches, which was to be carried out 24 hours after his seizure. This was done. The churches were all closed, and the people in sorrow and consternation met in the public squares, exasperated against the government, and organized public processions of penance to disarm the wrath of God. 2 days later the great volcano of Cotopaxi burst into eruption. Bridges were destroyed, clouds of ashes darkened the air, whole villages disappeared, and for 3 days the thickest darkness covered the whole country, so that the frightened people thought the hour of the Last Judgment was at hand. But neither the terrors of God nor of man arrested the action of the government. A decree of the 28th of June suspended the Concordat and re-established the law of patronage. The bishops protested as one man. The Bishop of Riobamba pronounced a sentence of excommunication against all, whether priest or layman, who should obey the new decree. Andrade withdrew the interdict from compassion for the faithful, and, concealed in the woods of Pichincha, lived as an anchorite while administering as well as he could to the needs of the Church at Quito. Vintimilla then tried to starve the clergy into submission by declaring that every bishop and priest, unless they obeyed his orders, should be deprived of their ecclesiastical revenues. The venerable Archbishop of Cuenca tried to reason with him upon these attempts at sacrilege, and exclaimed, "You incur one anathema and excommunication after the other. Have you forgotten, General Vintimilla, that you have a soul? Do you think God will not demand of you an account of your actions? Have you made a pact with death, or do you fancy there is no hell? As bishop and as citizen, I protest against this and all your other attempts against the Church of God." Vintimilla remained deaf to all remonstrances, but the people trembled with indignation. Even the Liberals remembered with sorrow the prophetic words of Garcia Moreno: "I do not want you, but you will want me. When I shall be no longer at hand to protect you, you will become the prey of the revolutionists." The patriots of Quito grouped themselves round General Yepes and fought in the streets of the capital till their last cartridge was exhausted. This exasperated the Radical party, who accused the bishops of having favoured the rising. The Bishop of Loja was obliged to escape across the frontier. The Bishop of Guayaquil was poisoned. The Bishop of Riobamba was only saved from his assassins by hiding in the mountains. All the notabilities of the Conservative party, magistrates, generals, or officials, were either imprisoned or sent into exile. Vintimilla hoped thus to induce the people to submit, but he was mistaken. The public indignation rose to such a height, and the oaths of "Down with Vintimilla" became so menacing, that the dictator found himself compelled either to fly or to change his policy. He made up his mind at last to get rid of Urbina and Montalvo, and to be reconciled with the bishops and the Church. He did so by placing himself under the protection of the Convention, which met again in 1878. When Pedro Carbo proposed to suppress the clause which declared the Catholic religion to be that of the State, Julio Castro, the Vice President, opposed the motion on the ground of inexpediency, and asserted that the Government was bound to support the actual state of things, which was unity of belief. Then 28 deputies proposed the abrogation of the decree suspending the Concordat, but the violence of Urbina stopped for a time this act of justice. The question of the liberty of the press next came under discussion, and restrictive laws were imposed to the rage of the Radicals. But Vintimilla had suddenly become a Conservative, and decreed that all the priests should be recalled from exile, and that Dr. Andrada and others, who had been pursued from political motives, should enjoy henceforth perfect liberty. Vintimilla, in fact, only wished to have an opportunity to indulge his passions and live at his ease. During the 4 succeeding years, the revenue of the state were entirely absorbed in pandering to the vice and luxuries of the President, and to paying off Urbina and his insatiable friends for the damages they pretended to have suffered under the reign of the tyrant Garcia Moreno. The dilapidation of the public finances was such that no finance minister had the courage to give in his accounts. All public works were stopped. Even the new roads were allowed to fall into decay. The university and colleges closed, the professors dismissed, the students scattered. Such, at the commencement of 1882, was the sad spectacle offered by Ecuador. The Conservatives rejoiced to see the end approaching of this fatal presidency, but Vintimilla only listened to his ambition, went to Guayaquil and got himself elected by his friends as a permanent dictator, and then, hoping to throw dust in the eyes of the Conservatives, he solemnly received the Apostolic Nuncio, to whom he declared that his only anxiety was to preserve and even draw closer the links which bound the nation to the Holy See. As a proof of his sincerity, he restored the Concordat and appointed his old enemy, Riobamba, as Archbishop of Quito. But he had reckoned too long on the patience of the people. They had tolerated a constitutional president. They could not stand a permanent dictator. The whole nation flew to arms. In the name of Garcia Moreno, of Ascasubi, and of Flores, they appealed to the army to become once more the real defenders of their country. On the 10th of January, the patriots surrounded and entered Quito, and after a sanguinary battle, took possession of the capital. 6 months later, Vintimilla was driven out of Guayaquil, his last refuge, as, 25 years before, Garcia Moreno had driven out Franco, the last of Urbina's lieutenants, and the reign of tyranny was at an end. End of Epilogue, Chapter 2. Epilogue, Chapter 3 of Garcia Moreno by Augustine BERTHE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. The Republic of the Sacred Heart, 1883-1886. The Republic of Ecuador could then calculate what the abandonment of the principles of Garcia Moreno had lost her. In 8 months the liberalism of Borrero had thrown her into the hands of the Radicals, and during the following 8 years the country had been completely ruined. All the public works of Garcia Moreno had been stopped. The treasury was empty, the schools and colleges closed, and nothing but bloodshed, poisonings, and plots were heard on every side. Three things only had, to a certain degree, arrested the total destruction of all Garcia Moreno's labours. The conduct of the clergy, who, in spite of persecutions and exile, had held to their high Catholic standard, the strong Catholic feeling of the people, who had clung to their bishops and, in many cases, forced the Radicals to draw back, and above all, God, who does not die, become, by the consecration of the Republic to the Sacred Heart, the official protector of Ecuador, had at last delivered the country from the hands of her tyrants. Garcia Moreno had prophesied, "After my death, Ecuador will fall again into the hands of the revolutionists, who will govern her as despots under the specious name of liberalism. But the Sacred Heart of Jesus, to whom I have consecrated my country, will save her once more, that she may live honoured and free under the safeguard of true Catholic principles." The Provisional Government, grateful for their unexpected victory, echoed the feelings of the people by decreeing immediately the erection of a national church dedicated to the Sacred Heart, to be built at the cost of the State, though aided by voluntary contributions. Of course, this proposal met with violent opposition from the Radical benches in the Chambers. They, pretending that God did not need temples made with hands to show gratitude for His benefits. But Dr. Montevelle, as champion of the Catholic cause, showed how the object of this monumental church was not to increase the number of churches, but to make a public, solemn, and national manifestation of the Catholic faith. "Gentlemen," the orator exclaimed, "the great crime of our days is the mean and cowardly apostasy of all the nations of the earth. All governments have ceased to recognize the social rights of Jesus Christ and of His Church. What we desire is that the Convention of 1884 should fall on its knees before the Divine Head of all the kingdoms of the earth, that the Republic should renew her original consecration, and raise a durable monument to attest to all future generations that Ecuador is the Republic of the Sacred Heart, not of the imaginary God of the pantheists, but of the true God, our Lord Jesus Christ." Moved by these noble words, more than 3/4 of the deputies voted for the proposal. The work of Garcia Moreno had thus borne its fruit, and proved that his memory was profoundly anchored in the hearts of his people. The Honourable José María Camano, one of the leading men of the Conservative Party, had been elected President a year before the 10th anniversary of the terrible drama at Quito, and he determined on a solemn glorification of the Christian hero, whom the miserable tyrants of the preceding years had so wantonly insulted. On the 6th of August, the whole city being hung with black, a magnificent service was held in the cathedral in the presence of all the bishops, the President, and the civil and military dignitaries. All eyes turned lovingly to the young Gabriel, then 15 years of age, who for the first time publicly led the mourning for his noble father. Around him were grouped the widow and relations of Garcia Moreno. The circle of "young Catholics" which he had established, the nobility of Quito, and an innumerable number of people of all ranks. The Apostolic Nuncio officiated amidst the tears of the assistants, and a beautiful funeral oration was pronounced by F. Perano, S.J., in which he dwelt on his noble nature, his admirable character, and the signal benefits he had conferred on his country, winding up with the words, "His murderers declared that August 6, 1875, would open out to the country a new era of peace and prosperity, that the death of the Ecuador Colossus would give a fresh start to civilization and progress. Fools, how have they kept their promise? Et nunc regis intelligite." The new President was worthy to listen to these great lessons. Conservative and Catholic, devoted to the Church and to the people, he did not understand a policy which made a pact with the Revolution. It is said that the day when he was to swear on the Gospels not to undertake anything against the Catholic Church, he went to see the widow of Garcia Moreno and asked her to lend him the scarf of her illustrious and noble husband. "I hold," he said, "to people looking upon me as the humble successor of his glorious and loyal policy." "I will not lend it, but give it to you," replied the noble-minded lady. "No one is more worthy to wear it than yourself." On June 21, 1886, a great Eucharistic Congress was held in Quito to celebrate the second centenary of the public worship of the Church to the Sacred Heart. The chambers were closed on that day, so that the whole of the deputies, with the President at their head, should celebrate this national fête. At sunrise, salvos of artillery woke the whole city. At 7 o'clock, the whole of the churches were filled with men and women of every rank to receive Holy Communion. In the cathedral alone, 10,000 souls received the bread of life. Then followed a solemn act of faith and reparation, pronounced by the Archbishop in presence of all the civil, military, and ecclesiastical authorities. It ran as follows: "King of kings and Lord of lords, on whom alone depend all the empires and nations of the earth, in gratitude for thy great mercies, the public authorities of Church and State, prostrated at thy feet, offer to thy divine heart, and consecrate to it for ever the Republic of Ecuador. Deign to accept this people as thy heritage, to reign over them forever, to deliver them from their enemies, and to show to the whole world the happiness enjoyed by a nation which has chosen thee for its Saviour and its God." Then began, amidst the tears of the assistants, the act of expiation and reparation for all the offences committed against the Divine Majesty. "Lord and God, our Creator and Master, by whom alone all kings reign and legislators rule the nations of the world, to Thee are due solemn acts of praise and thanksgiving, for having defended us from our enemies and overwhelmed us with Thy gifts. But alas, instead of corresponding with Thy goodness, we have sinned against Thee, we have trodden underfoot Thy divine laws, and deserved all Thy chastisements. Look not upon our iniquities, O Lord, but only upon Thy mercy." Then followed the litany of reparation, the responses being said by the whole people: "For all our iniquities, pardon us, good Lord. For the sins of Thy priests, pardon, pardon. For the injustices of our rulers, for the faults of our magistrates, for the sins of fathers of families, for the crimes of unworthy men, for their impieties and blasphemies, for their perjuries and sacrileges, for our revolutions and fratricidal wars, for the attacks against ecclesiastical authority, for the plots against civil authority, for the horrible crimes of the 6th of August and the 30th of March, for the shameful excesses of the press, for our political crimes, for our public scandals, in a word, for all our social iniquities. Pardon us, good Lord, pardon us," cried the whole immense multitude as with one voice. A few days after this act of public expiation, the Feast of the Sacred Heart reunited again all the ecclesiastical and civil authorities, who, with the President at their head, consecrated themselves, one by one, anew to the Sacred Heart. Their example was followed by the whole city, and until the end of that great day, soldiers, judges, fathers and mothers of families, young men and children filled the great basilica, renewing one by one their act of consecration. This scene, worthy of the heroic ages of faith, proved that the work of Garcia Moreno had not died with him. But an equally strong proof was given in 1887, when the whole world prepared to celebrate the Jubilee of our Holy Father, Leo XIII. After a magnificent speech from President Caamano, the Congress voted a decree of congratulation to the Pope and a protestation of unalterable fidelity, while the sum of 50,000 francs was voted as the offering of the nation, and the 31st of December was appointed as a national fête, when the Te Deum was to be sung in all the churches in presence of the authorities. The Archbishop of Quito also presented to the Pope, in the name of the faithful, a massive silver reliquary containing a relic of the Blessed Marianne de Jesus, beautifully cased with emblematic devices, which included a medallion of the President Martyr Garcia Moreno. The offering was accompanied by a touching letter from President Caamano, which rivaled the Christian utterances of our martyred hero. Among other gifts was a magnificent portrait of Garcia Moreno, holding in his hand his celebrated protest against the invasion of the Pontifical States. But on the day of the audience at the Vatican, the envoy extraordinary from Ecuador, M. Antonio Flores, son of the illustrious Flores, remitted another gift to the Pope, in a precious casket of crystal de roche, ornamented with precious stones, a gift which was more striking and significant than any which had preceded it, and of which M. Flores gave the following explanation: "Most Holy Father, I am extremely touched at the honour granted to me by your Holiness of being allowed in person to present my homages and those of my countrymen, in addition to the humble offering which I have submitted to His Eminence, the Cardinal Secretary of State. In this crystal casket, I have taken it upon myself to place the autograph message which our beloved and regretted President, Garcia Moreno, bore in his hands on the day of his cruel immolation, and which is all stained with his heroic blood. I implore your Holiness to accept this offering, which I have the honour to make in my own name and in that of a Catholic writer, M. Eloy Alfaro y Vega, who picked up this precious document on the site of the crime, which was read to the chambers after his martyrdom, and which he sent to me abroad, where I have carefully kept it for the last 9 years." Greatly touched at the sight of this relic, Leo XIII. Answered the ambassador: "We offer our most ardent wishes for the prosperity of Ecuador and its President, to whom we earnestly recommend the interests of the Catholic faith, which will ensure the happiness of the people. We accept also with joy the precious gift which your Excellency has presented to us on this our happy anniversary. This autograph message which the illustrious Garcia Moreno proposed to read to Congress before he was struck down by the hands of assassins, we shall religiously preserve as a touching remembrance of a man who was the champion of the Catholic faith, and to whom may be justly applied the words made use of by the Church to celebrate the memory of the holy martyrs, St. Thomas of Canterbury and St. Stanislaus of Poland, pro ecclesia gladis emporium occubuit." We will close this biography with these words of the great Pontiff, and we venture to hope that a new era of prosperity is opening for Ecuador under the shadow of the cross, for the President elected in 1888 is the same Antonio Flores who presented the bloody message of his martyred predecessor to the Pope, a man of wisdom and experience, having had occasion during his many diplomatic missions both in Europe and America to meditate on the evils which ruin nations and on the errors which destroy governments. He is thoroughly inspired with the two maxims of Garcia Moreno: liberty for all and for everything, except for evil and wrongdoers, and again, seek ye first the kingdom of God and His justice, and all other things shall be added unto you. May the God, who never dies, maintain His sovereignty over this nation of our martyred hero, and preserve it as the type and model of a truly Christian state. End of Epilogue, Chapter 3. End of Garcia Moreno, President of Ecuador, 1821 to 1875, by Augustine BERTHE.